All right, let's get started. Lovely to be here. My name is Michelle Biss. I am the project manager of the National Right to Housing Network, and it is my total pleasure to open up this session, Nothing About Us Without Us and the Right to Housing in Canada. I am joining you today from the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples, and today's session is co-hosted by the National Right to Housing Network, and in particular, the Canadian Lived Experience Leadership Network. So as many folks know, there have been some really important progress moments that have happened over the past year. Back in November of 2020, we saw a major movement on the right to housing with the appointment process of the National Housing Council and the start of the call for applications for the federal housing applicants. Really important in terms of implementing the right to housing in Canada. But that said, this also spurred a lot of incredibly important conversations among folks about the way that people with lived experience of homelessness and living experience of homelessness are integrated into decision-making and are centered in terms of their experience. So with that, we have a really excellent session ahead of us with some incredible panelists. I will soon, in a moment, be passing the mic over to my colleague, Michelle Bielik, who works very closely with the Canadian Lived Experience Leadership Network, and she will lead us through a land acknowledgement. Following Michelle's comments, we will be hearing from a great friend and ally, Adam Vaughn, Parliamentary Secretary of the Minister of Families, Children and Social Development. And then we will go to the real reason we are all here, which is hearing directly from panelists about the ways that lived experience of homelessness has led the charge in terms of building and strengthening the right to housing in Canada, and looking forward to how we can make sure that decisions are framed around this experience from here on out. Just a quick housekeeping note for folks. At the end of the panel, we will have some moments to address some of the questions from participants. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to pose them as the conversation is happening in the Q&A box, and we will have a moment to get to that at the end of the session. So with that, welcome, and I pass the mic over to my incredible colleague, Michelle Bielik.
Well, thank you very much, Michelle. My name is Michelle Bielik, and I use the pronouns she and her. I'm first going to just start with a land acknowledgement, knowing that we are all joining Pan-Canada right now. So we are acknowledging the land which we are situated on, and recognize the land is an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those Indigenous territories you reside and work on. We are also honoring the Indigenous people who have been living and working on the land from time immemorial. We also acknowledge the long-standing history that has brought us to reside on this land, also known as Turtle Island, and seek to understand our place within that history. Colonialism is a current and ongoing process, and we need to build mindfulness of our present participation in colonialism and our commitment to decolonize our structures and systems, and seek out actions in our commitment to reconciliation. Only we are accountable to these relationships. So first off, I'd like to introduce our guest, Adam Vaughn. He will be speaking for a few minutes and greeting all of you. And Adam is the MP for Spadina-Fort York. He's also the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister for Families, Children and Social Development. Adam?
I guess I'm to speak and my microphone will be activated.
We can hear you, Adam. You're all good.
Thanks very much. Sorry, the slide is still up. I apologize. As introduced, my name is Adam Vaughn, Member of Parliament for Spadina-Fort York, and I speak to you today from the historic and traditional territories of the Mississauga, as well as the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, including the Ojibwe, and as well the Huron-Wendat, as well as, of course, from across Turtle Island. Toronto has always been a gathering place for many different nations, and continues to this day to gather not just across Turtle Island, but of course from around the world, and in particular governed by the Treaty of the Mississauga of the New Credit Hold. I first would like to begin by thanking this network, and the people with lived experience who have been serving on the front lines, providing support to everyone from those sleeping rough to those in encampments, to those in shelters, to those sometimes referred to as the invisible homeless. And I'd like to thank and honor the service to all of our health that individuals from your community have made. It's a profound dedication and a very precarious situation. I'd also like to thank those in leadership positions for the homeless sector and for housing advocacy, because people with lived experience have won the right to be at the table and are properly at the table as we design systems to achieve what we need to achieve in the coming months and years. I'd also like to immediately address the issue of people with lived experience in the housing advocacy panel. It's very tricky to get all the diversity wrapped up in 12 individuals who've been appointed. 5 do have lived experience, but not lived experience of chronic homelessness. That's a failing on our part, and I've been assured and talked to the minister just before we came on the line today to make sure that I can tell you that the situation will be remedied in very short order, literally the next cabinet meeting, and we hope to have an announcement very shortly to make up for a shortfall which should not have happened, but unfortunately has. But it will be rectified before the advisory panel even meets. So hopefully that's good news. There were some very bold moves in the fall that I think are a credit to the advocacy and the hard work and the research that your organization and others have made. The commitment to end chronic homelessness is real. The $1 billion rapid housing program, which was made simultaneously to that, most of it has, in terms of the city's file, has gone out the door, and you'll be seeing announcements all through this month and next on the project stream to make sure that we deliver new housing, immediate resources to the sector, to get as many people into safer situations as possible, and to house them permanently going forward as we commit to ending chronic homelessness. The budget will have the sort of rapid housing 2.0 and next steps in ending chronic homelessness, but it will also include 2 other new chapters to the National Housing Strategy, long overdue. One of them is an urban, rural, and northern housing strategy with funding to be Indigenous-led, Indigenous-delivered, Indigenous-managed, and to provide a 4th stream or 4th direction in our support of making sure that all Canadians get the housing they need, including, but most importantly, intentional programs and Indigenous-led programs in the urban, rural, and northern space outside the 3 national Indigenous organizations that handle it in other areas of the country. The second one is support for a stronger capital stream for and stronger subsidy program, including picking up lapsed agreements inside the co-op sector. This move is about prevention. The more deeply affordable social housing we can build, the fewer people that will fall into homelessness and become chronically homeless if the services aren't provided. So the housing file is growing, is getting strengthened, and will be better within a few weeks' time than it was even as we started this conversation this morning. The final piece of the puzzle are supports. Supportive housing doesn't work without supports. We are in conversation with provincial governments right across the country on health files. This is included in the approach to long-term care, which is just another form of supportive housing, and quite often people who have chronic conditions well before they turn 65 end up in long-term care, and some of them do come from the community of people who are currently in municipal shelters or in precarious housing situations. Delivering the services is critical to making sure that the supportive housing programs work, and in fact the rapid housing programs work, and making sure that in particular mental health and addiction supports are community-based, but also making sure that developmental disabilities and brain injury are addressed in our housing programs and in our healthcare programs is fundamental to making sure that we end chronic homelessness. And then finally, and I think what's most important in terms of next steps, is the vaccine and proper care for people that are continuing to battle COVID and battle homelessness, two crises the country is managing simultaneously. I want to assure you that we are paying particular attention to the second wave of the vaccines that are going out into the area of personal support workers and other individuals who are in precarious situations. We want to make sure that people who are serving the homeless and the homeless themselves are identified as part of that second tier of populations that are in vulnerable settings. And so a focus is on that, and we'll have more information as we sit down with the provinces and as the vaccine supply is strengthened going forward. And just on that note, you may hear rumblings that the vaccine supply is a tricky one. Of course it is. This is new territory for all of us internationally, domestically, and within the pharmaceutical industry. But as we experience a slowdown next week in the Pfizer, I want to assure you that Moderna is sustaining its shipments. And we still have well over almost 200,000 doses in storage right now. So we are in some choppy water, but certainly not water that isn't being transversed. But we will get more vaccines, and we were on schedule to fulfill our commitments to get Canadians vaccinated by September. We are prioritizing and working hard at the provinces to make sure that the sector is addressed in terms of its vulnerabilities and the precariousness and the dangers, quite frankly, that you're bringing to your families as you work in the sector. And we are here to work with you to solve not only the threat that COVID provides, but as I said, our commitment to end chronic homelessness is real, it is substantial, and hopefully you will see in the weeks ahead the next stages and be comforted by the strength and the seriousness of our commitment. And with that, I wish you a great conference and a happy day. Events south of the border put a few smiles on our faces, but there's serious work still to be done in our country. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Adam, for joining us today. We appreciate it, and thank you for being an ally of our movement. So I would like to move ahead and introduce our moderator, our impeccable moderator today, who is Elizabeth McIsaac. And Elizabeth is the president of Maytree. She will be leading the discussion today. Our panelists, our incredible panelists who will be centering our conversation today. We'll start off by introducing Alex Nelson. Alex uses the pronouns they and them and is a PhD candidate in anthropology at Western University, whose research looks at gender, lived experience of homelessness, and housing policy. Alex focuses on the ways in which lived experience and narratives of homelessness can be mobilized to enact meaningful policy change. Alex serves on the steering committee of the Canadian Lived Experience Leadership Network, as well as on the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network. They also lead the Lived Experience Committee on the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network. Alex has facilitated sessions focused on lived expertise and narrative for the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness's national conferences. Welcome, Alex. Next is Al Wiebe. After Al had lost his position in advertising, he couldn't handle the trauma of that experience and then suffered from unchecked clinical depression. As a result, Al spent 26 months homeless on the streets of Winnipeg. Al was initially turned away and ignored by the healthcare system as a person experiencing homelessness, yet was eventually helped by that same system in the end, supporting his recovery, housing, and integration back into living. Al is a 24/7 advocate for the homeless and for those experiencing poverty. He is chair of the Lived Experience Circle in Winnipeg and co-chairs the Canadian Lived Experience Leadership Network. Al directs the Lived Experience-led, empathy-driven housing program in Winnipeg and is facilitating a lived experience leadership program in a 3-year national project. Al specializes in community and peer engagement and serves on many boards and committees from homelessness to poverty, health, human rights, and also serves on the Reaching Home Community Advisory Board in Winnipeg. Al is also the host of a radio show called Of No Fixed Address, which educates and advocates for issues of poverty and homelessness on the airwaves. Al will continue to advocate for people with lived experience of homelessness through the United Way Speakers Bureau and through his writings featured in national media. Welcome, Al.
Thank you.
Next, I'd like to introduce Cheyanne Ratnam. Cheyanne is a Jaffna Tamil and is passionate about equity and developing inclusive and accessible spaces and processes. She has dedicated much of her time and expertise in child welfare and homelessness and their intersectionalities. In 2016, she was the recipient of York University's Bryden One to Watch Alumni Award, and in 2017 was recognized by the United Way of Greater Toronto as one of 3 women who inspired International Women's Day. She is the co-founder and executive lead of the Ontario Children's Advancement Coalition and is a provincial representative on the National Council of Youth in Care Advocates. She serves on the board of the Children's Aid Societies of Toronto as vice chair and the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion lead. She also serves on the board of Scarborough West Community Legal Clinic and serves on the Association of Community Legal Clinics of Ontario's Race Equity Working Group. Cheyanne is also an advocate regarding childhood sexual abuse and gender-based violence and intimate partner violence, and is a survivor of both. She co-leads the Gender Equity and Women's Rights Committee at the Tamil Canadian Centre for Civic Action, is a program facilitator and coordinator for Next Gen at the Mosaic Institute, and is an independent consultant, advisor, coach, and public speaker. Cheyanne currently works as an engagement specialist and consults for both the Housing Outreach Project Collaborative BYFY, By Youth for Youth project, and the Making the Shifts project, understanding young women's experiences of loneliness and isolation during COVID-19 and beyond. Welcome, Cheyanne. Next is Debbie McGraw. Debbie has worked tirelessly since 1995 on the elimination of poverty in Saskatchewan, as well as in Canada. She spent many years as an advocate, activist, and researcher on social issues such as housing, homelessness, women's issues, and poverty. Debbie's strength for her work has come from her own lived experiences. Debbie learned how to take her experience, frustrations, anger, and knowledge and turn them into powerful tools for social change. After 20 years of raising her children, Debbie enrolled in university, graduating in 1998 with both her certificate and bachelor's degree in social work. She has spent 8 years on the Canada Without Poverty Board of Directors and recently co-founded the Lived Experience Advisory Council Canada, which is now the Canadian Lived Experience Leadership Network. When the National Housing Strategy was announced, Debbie started working with Emily Paradis and others to ensure that this strategy was human rights based. And Debbie continues to remain part of this work as a committee member of the National Right to Housing Network. Over the last 7 years, Debbie worked at Mumford House, a homelessness shelter for women and children, and then Lighthouse Supported Living, Inc., as a housing locator, and shortly after moving to a rapid rehousing case manager with the Housing First program. Debbie has worked for Saskatoon Housing Initiative Partnership as a housing case manager. Debbie is also the proud mom of 5 grown children and the grandma to 16, ranging from age 18 months to 22 years old. Welcome, welcome, Debbie. And now let's start the dialogue. Elizabeth, to you.
Thank you, Michelle. And thank you to both organizations who have brought this event together. I think it's an incredibly timely and important conversation for us to have in Canada, and certainly in the movement around building a human rights-based approach to housing and to more broadly as we strengthen the social protections that we offer, that we have available in this country. I want to thank them for the invitation to be part of this. It's certainly humbling, as we've just listened to the bios of each of the panelists. I was saying the other day that most of the panelists get more done in an hour than I do in a week. So pleased to have you. I'm going to ask the panelists to please mute. Thank you. If you're not speaking, please mute so that we are able to hear what's going on. So we're going to begin. We're going to have a round of questions. We want to engage all the panelists on these questions. And then by about 1 o'clock, we're going to turn it over to questions from the audience. So if you have questions that you want to begin writing into the Q&A box, please do. I will be looking there to pull out questions to put to the panelists. But let's begin and let the panelists tell their story. And I want to begin with just an opening for each of them to have an opportunity to talk about what their journey to leadership as a person with lived experience of homelessness. What has that journey been like? What have been the highlights? How would you define that journey for yourself? And I'm going to begin with Al and Debbie. There's a slide up on your screen which really has built out the timeline of lived expert leadership that has led to the right to housing in Canada. Al and Debbie have both been involved in this for decades. And so
Yes.
I'm going to ask them to highlight in a couple of minutes some of the highlights they felt along that journey and how that's been part of their own story. So we'll start with Al.
Sure. Deb and I spent a good deal of time last night going over our timeline, and then well, now we found out we have 3 minutes. So what I'm going to do is just point out highlights for myself personally on the timeline of lived experience and how it has affected the homeless sector in our country. And, you know, first of all, I think we cannot go anywhere without talking about At Home Chez Soi, the $110 million national project that puts many people, took many people off the streets. And unfortunately, I was on the negative side of that program, not getting housing, but it really opened the doors to showing the effectiveness of housing folks as compared to leaving them on the street. Secondly, I wanted to talk about one of the highlight for me was Canadian Alliance on Homelessness second conference in Vancouver. And the word watershed was used, and I think that's appropriate because that is where the first kind of a national lived experience group was formed in the Lived Experience Advisory Council. And also we adopted or began to adopt the 7 principles of lived experience that have been published nationally and does talk about what needs to be done with lived experience and moving that forward. Another session that was really important to me and really stood out, and this is where we got the whole the vision of the National Housing Council was brought forward, and that was by lived experience people, where Deb and I and a number of other people cross country were asked to put together sessions and facilitate sessions on lived experience and on what they saw that was needed to move forward in homelessness. And the vision for the council came from people with lived experience, and I think that's something that we should really all be really thrilled about. In 2016, I got an email asking me to come to Ottawa to be part of the expert roundtable on homelessness, and I said, "You got the wrong person. You don't want me. You want somebody else." I did not realize that people had their eyes on me. So, but indeed, for me to go to that particular session showed me that the government is paying attention to people with lived experience. And for me, that was a real cornerstone event because, yes, people with lived experience are being noticed, and it was extremely important. Another really important event was the discussions that came out of the Ottawa expert roundtable on right to housing, and Devin, myself, and Cheyanne Ratnam were there, and we were part of the discussion in what needed to be done and how to formulate the council and the advocate and what steps were needed to get there and strategies that were needed to get there. And all 3 of us were extremely proud and happy to be there. And it again showed that, yes, they're paying attention to lived experience folks, and we are starting to have a voice. And from that came discussions that a number of people with lived experience led, Deb and myself, and I'm not sure, I think Cheyanne may have been involved in that in Toronto, but we led discussions again on what does housing mean to you with people with lived experience and people who are experiencing homelessness. What is housing to you? Why is it important to you? And from that, that led to further discussions or further points taken by the government through Emily Parody at the University of Toronto and put into work. Again, we cannot forget in 2019 that the right to housing was embedded in legislation. And a really strong group of people worked tirelessly on that for several years. And finally, the right to housing was embedded in legislation. Now we just have to, work on and finding a way to make that work. And in 2020, Deb and I were part of a group discussion with Tim Richter and Michelle Billick from the Canadian Alliance on Homelessness, and asked to start up a lived experience group, and that group is now the Canadian Lived Experience Leadership Network, and that was formed last year. And we intend to be a strong voice in advocacy for people with lived experience, and in lobbying government officials into maybe perhaps making right decisions. And so in a few short months, we've grown to a membership of over 250. So, we are becoming a force. And I'd just like to say I'm really pleased to be here today to be part of this really important discussion. Deb?
Thanks, Al. Debbie, over to you. And Al, can I ask you to mute yourself, please?
Oh, sure.
Thanks. Over to Debbie.
Okay, I just unmuted myself. Hi, everybody. Welcome. My passion for what I'm doing actually started back when I was in university. Prior to going to university, my power had been cut off, and there was an organization here in Saskatoon called Equal Justice for All that was all volunteer run, and they advocated for those on social services, and they helped me to get my power turned back on. And I realized I want to do that. I want to help people. I want to be the same as them. So I ended up doing a practicum placement there. And from there, my passion just grew. And I became a board member of Canada Without Poverty. I served as second vice president, first vice president, and president. And from there, I also was invited to Washington to a UN symposium on women's issues. And they had tables for women who had homelessness issues, domestic abuse, child apprehensions, and everything you can think of that affect women. Social services, all that kind of thing. And from there is just, I started to realize how important it is for people with lived experience to have voices, to be a part of the conversations, to be involved. And the more I became involved in the housing issue, I started to realize, well, it's not just about housing, but it's also the biggest thing, like what we face here in Saskatoon. It's about affordable housing too. We need to ensure affordable housing. And that's the goal here, is to make sure that this national housing strategy and the rights to housing is not only just housing, but housing that people can afford. Because I know here it's not affordable. I work with homeless people every day, and I fight to house them, and I struggle to house them, and we identify their barriers and their needs, assess their needs, because the key thing is when you're working to house people, you don't want to set them up for failure. We want them to be successful. So we need to assess, is there mental health issues? Is there addiction issues? Do they need to be in a group home? Do they need to be in supported living? Will they survive in public housing? So we need to look at all of those things when housing people. So I'll go back to some of the key things that led me to where I am. Al talked about a lot of them, so there's not a lot left to cover. I'm sort of losing my train of thought here. I'm just going to turn it over to Elizabeth.
Okay. We'll come back. You're going to have another. Yeah. You're going to have another go at this. Debbie, I loved how you began your story, and I don't know if it was an intended metaphor or not, but your journey of leadership began when your power was cut off. Yeah. And so that's almost then your power began.
Yeah.
So it's a great story.
Thank you.
I'm going to turn to Alex next. Alex, do you want to tell us a bit about your journey? And Debbie, can I ask you to mute, please? Thanks.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Al and Debbie, for the things that you've shared. I think it really contextualizes a lot of important elements of this conversation. I guess I'll start with the very first time I ever spoke about my lived experience of homelessness was actually to a social worker in elementary school. And my mom had told me, you can never tell anybody what our life at home is like. And so I didn't. And pretty quickly after I told this social worker about our homelessness, I was taken into foster care. And the lesson I took from this was it's dangerous to talk about your lived experience. There are consequences when you talk about your lived experience. And those consequences are very, very real. And this really stayed with me for a long time. I didn't talk about my lived experience. I didn't share because I was terrified, and I felt so much shame and so much guilt. I really thought that it was my fault for speaking about homelessness. So I ended up, I started university, and I took a course on homelessness with a professor who was just like incredible and so understanding. And I ended up approaching my lived experience through writing. And it was really powerful for me. It was the first time I was ever able to really fully express the things that had happened to me, to talk about the power dynamics that were at play, to talk about structural issues. And it allowed me to think about my experiences as more than just my fault or the fault of my family. And I thought that was really like important for me personally. So I ended up going to the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness conference in Winnipeg in 2017. It was my first homelessness conference. And actually for a panel, a roundtable discussion for what became the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network, I ended up standing up in front of the room of other members of the network and saying, I am a person with lived experience of homelessness. And that's really about all I could say before I ended up having a panic attack. And two of the current members of the Women's Network helped me out of the room. And one of them was another lived expert. And she sat me down, she got me calmed down. And it was really just, I really think that lived experience in that moment was so necessary to connect with me, to bring me back down, to say like, I know this is really difficult, but you did something important. And it was from then that I joined the Women's Network as a member. Now I sit on the steering committee. And this is all part of a journey that's been so important to me, to recognize the potential for leadership in lived experience rather than just a source of, such immense like negative emotion. It can be something that allows you to connect and make change. So that's where I'm coming to this discussion from, and I'm so thankful to be here today. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. It's a powerful story and really highlights the importance of support and networks around a leadership journey. Cheyanne, I know you have a bit of a fire alarm going on behind you. Are you able to join us?
I think the sound should be, it's kind of loud. Can you hear it? Can you hear me properly? That's the better question.
We can hear you.
Okay, perfect. All right. So first of all, thank you so much for having me here. I just wanted to quickly start off by saying that I am joining you from Scarborough, Ontario, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And of course, it's home to diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, as well as settlers like ourselves. My journey with lived experience started before I was born. My family was IDP, so internally displaced persons in the island nation of Ceylon. I was born into a refugee environment. I was a refugee. And so my homelessness started way before I was even conceived, while I was conceived, while I was born. And it's been an interesting journey because my family has always been on the homelessness spectrum. And as we know, homelessness is not just explicit street involvement. It's a whole spectrum. You could be housed, but not have enough money for other things. And so it's really about housing precarity. And for me, my other homeless experiences started as well in elementary school. I'm a child sexual abuse survivor, and it was not addressed properly. And so I lost a lot of my allies within my family unit that I couldn't trust anymore. And so by the time I was about 13, I actually started to experience explicit homelessness. Up until 13, as a child, I didn't know what to do, where to go. You don't really have anywhere to go. You don't have children's shelters. You have youth shelters and stuff like that. But at 13, I began to experience homelessness on that hidden homelessness spectrum, which a lot of, Black, Indigenous, peoples of color experience wildly within the Toronto context, which is hidden homelessness. So I was couch surfing, I was going to parties, I was partying on the weekends so that I didn't have to go to a violent environment. I grew up in a lot of abuse and abusive situations. And so that propelled me to start to escape. I used to use the word runaway, but runaway is a criminalized terminology that we often use for young people. And really and truly, the reality is that we're actually escaping and protecting ourselves. And so at 13, I ended up homeless in another context. And then I entered the child welfare system and grew up in the group care system for the rest of that time, into my teenagehood, into my adulthood. And that is also in itself a type of homelessness as well, because it's temporary where you're living. At the age of 18, you're often, actually not often, but most of the time, you're kicked out of the system because now you've reached this age indicator, and then you're left to fend for yourself. And so for me, that was also something. And then later on, I entered a relationship actually when I was 15 years old, and I stayed with this person for 12 years. And it was a very precarious relationship. And we never talk about young people in violent relationships. Intimate partner violence is often thought of as an adult situation, but it actually spans across lifespans. And so I was almost sheltering myself with this person to have shelter, but I was in this very violent situation that I couldn't escape from because of my other intersectional identities that prevented me from leaving in the first place. So I've experienced homelessness over time in many different ways. And that's where a lot of, my inspiration for what I do came from. In grade 4, I was actually the youngest person, I would say, to be a homeless outreach worker, with parental permission, of course. I was part of the Toronto Homeless Outreach Program of Hope, which was founded by one of the teachers in my elementary school, and she recruited me. And on the weekends, I used to go with her to the streets of Toronto to have conversations with people who were experiencing homelessness and housing precarity. And I was actually able to be on 680 News, and we got a meeting with the former Mayor Mel Lastman. It was myself, another child, and the founder of the organization. So my advocacy work started when I was 8 years old, and then it started to happen also while I was growing up in the child welfare system, to advocate for other people. And now in my professional life, I have a bachelor's and master's degrees. So academically and professionally, it's really ended up, being interconnected and interwoven with everything that I do, whether it's child welfare, whether it's immigration, whether it's anything. And I've been very lucky to work with Debbie and Al since 2012. And, everything on that slide after 2012, I've been involved in, and it's been such a great roller coaster of an experience. And I'm so grateful to even take up space and occupy space here today, and know that there are plenty of other people who could have been in this place. And so I want to acknowledge this privilege to be here to share my experience and my knowledge with you folks today.
Thanks, Cheyanne. Powerful stories, all of you, and humbling. Part of what we talked about running up to this was the fact that when you're a lived expert, you're inherently an activist or an advocate. You're bringing forward an experience, you're challenging conversations, you're challenging the norm. And there's also an experience that there's a stigma attached to it, that there are judgments or assumptions that may be made, and you bring your whole self. And a couple of you have already spoken. Alex, you put it so well when you said, there's real consequences when you come forward to talk about your existence as not having a home. And so I wonder if you could each touch a little bit on what impact this has had on you personally or professionally as a leader. So I'm going to start this time. We're going to move backwards. So Cheyanne, you're going to just keep going and pick up where you left off.
Great. Yeah, intersectionality is very important. When we talk about power, privilege, oppression, marginalization, subjugation, the way in which our bodies are politically stated, our existence is political, our existence already has narratives attached to them prior to when we were born, but also currently as we're living. And so for me, my intersections of being a visibly melanated, blessed with melanin person, and as a woman, as a person who struggled with trauma and mental health, and a person who was a young person who experienced homelessness, a person from the child welfare system, but not only the child welfare system, but I wasn't adopted, I wasn't in foster care, I was in group homes, which is the lowest of the lows of the child welfare system. You know, all of these identities, you know, they play a role in terms of how I navigated the system, the type of freedom I had in terms of fluidity of navigation, but also the types of barriers and access to resources and supports that I received. You know, they were also impacted through my intersectional identities. And so in different spaces, I was very much subjugated, sometimes silenced. In other spaces, I did have privilege because I learned from a very young age how important it is to realize and learn how to mute certain identities that you have in certain spaces and elevate other identities that you have so that you can negotiate power and negotiate that control. And I used to do that since I was a kid. And when I started my social work program, it was like, oh, I've been doing this my entire life. So it was really easy to write my essays and stuff. But, you know, identity is very personal, but it is very political, and identity and your intersections play such a crucial role in terms of how you are responded to and how you are reacted to and how you occupy multiple spaces, whether at the same time, in a parallel place, or separately. Because, you know, oftentimes, like as a person, I've always been the first of many, and so I was always the first person who looked like me in spaces. I was always in predominantly Caucasian white passing spaces, and I was that token person. And you know, it's not a bad thing, but it's not a good thing. There needs to be more representation in terms of people who look like me, with my background, with my historical experiences and narratives in spaces, because you know, Canada is a diverse country, and we know that homelessness is experienced very differently across the nation, whether it's local homelessness in urban areas, in remote areas, in rural areas. Indigenous homelessness looks very different in rural versus local. My homelessness would have looked different if I was from Thunder Bay versus Toronto. And so what does that mean as an individual, as a person going through and experiencing these systems, but also living life trying to make something out of yourself? So me going through school, I was still facing homelessness. I was in that very precarious situation. I was almost killed 3 times in that relationship. That's how violent it was. And while I was doing that, I was in school and getting through school. And so it's about that multi-layered history and multi-layered current context and future context of how all of our lives are affected, but also impacted by our different intersections that we also carry with us.
Thank you, Cheyanne. Thank you to all of you. You're sharing so much, and it's rich, it's personal, and just I want to express appreciation for the courage that it takes to do this. And I know that this is what you take into your advocacy and your when you go to tables to talk about lived experience of homelessness. It takes a lot of courage, and I just want to acknowledge that at this point. I'm going to turn it to Alex now to pick it up.
Thank you so much. And Cheyanne, I think you really said it well when you say, like, we have to navigate so many different elements of our identities, and obviously, like, my experiences are quite different as a white settler person, but I completely understand, I understand in part, and I do a lot of work on disability justice and incorporating principles of disability justice into my work as a person with a disability. And one of the principles of disability justice is recognizing that people bring their whole selves to discussions. And that includes all of the different types of privilege and oppression that we each experience as individuals. And all of our experiences come to that table when we engage in this sort of work, whether we're people with disabilities or not. It's really important to recognize that nobody is just a monolithic entity. We're made up of different experiences and communities and identities. One thing that's been really interesting is working in a lot of women's homelessness spaces as someone who identifies as non-binary. I've really had to sit in sort of like uneasy alliance with a lot of like cisgender women, which is not a problem, but it makes advocacy a little interesting for me, because sometimes it means foregoing aspects of my identity or experience in order to move forward understandings of gender and homelessness. And so I like to do that work. I'm really excited about talking about gender and homelessness because I think it's such an important conversation. And experiences of women, girls, and gender diverse people are really different. Gender as a series of sort of power dynamics is something that impacts our everyday existence, and homelessness is just one of those ways that it can manifest or impact us. I also think about the fact that I am an academic and trying to reconcile the privilege that I have in academia with my lived experiences, especially because so much of what we know about homelessness has been extracted from people with lived experience of homelessness, or is on the backs of people with lived experience of homelessness. And our voices are not always included in the final product. And that's been really challenging because academia is such a fraught space. And it's not just academia, it's the same story for policy work or other places where you're engaged in the process of creating knowledge or creating truths about people and the world that we live in. And I mean, I've been hurt by these truths that have been constructed without people like me trying to create them. And even truths that have been produced by people I've come to know and respect and care about. And when we talk about what it means to know something, what we're really talking about is who's had the power and privilege to define the terms of the conversation. And I think that it's so important for people with lived experience of homelessness and diverse lived experiences of homelessness to be engaged in that conversation from the conception of research to the very end stage of disseminating that research. And lived experience is such a specialized, but it's such an important form of knowledge. It's expertise, lived expertise. And I'm really happy to be able to bring those identities to the table when I'm talking about creating new knowledge in academic spaces, in policy spaces, in nonprofit spaces. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Alex. So important to talk about different knowledges with equal value and credibility, and being able to navigate that. You're in a very unique position, so it's so good to hear about the challenges and how you've been able to work through that. Debbie, I saw you nodding a lot with what your fellow panelists were saying.
I can relate to a lot of what everybody has been saying, especially around their stories. I was pregnant at 15 and I was kicked out of my house and became a mom 3 months after my 16th birthday. So it took me years to figure out who I was and who I wanted to be and to learn how to navigate the systems. You know, I had to go on welfare and spent years in domestic abuse relationships, you know, getting beat up all the time. But experiencing the welfare system really hit me hard. They wanted me to go back to school. The one school that they wanted me to go to was $800, so they wouldn't send me there because I was not considered a resident of Saskatchewan because I actually came from Toronto. And so then they sent me to a Catholic school. But there was a lot of rules and regulations. Okay, I'm a mom. I'm proud of I took responsibility for my actions. But the school is telling me I can't talk about my child. I can't tell anybody I'm a mom. I can't share pictures or stories about my child. And I think this is where my action actually started. Was 3 weeks into being in that school, I had waited for a Christian ethics class, and I took a bunch of pictures to school of my son, and I shared them in Christian ethics, and I got kicked out. But I made it clear to the school that, you know, this is who I am. This is my identity. I'm a mom. I'm also very young. I'm taking responsibility. You need to work with me. you know, and times going into social services and being told, I don't know how to budget, I don't know how to do this, I'm not looking after my child, you know, I'm not looking after my responsibilities, I'm not feeding my kids. You know, having you walk out of there in tears, you learn to understand the policies and how they affect you. And so once I started going back to university and started getting involved and started learning more about the policies, one of the key things for me is learning how important it is to have the lived experience voices at those tables, like Cheyenne, Al, and Alex have all talked about, because who understands the policies better than those of us that have to live by them and that are affected by them. And so that whole journey and everything I've done today has led me up to where I am now. And bottom line is I have a big mouth and I'm not afraid to say things.
Thank goodness.
I'll leave it at that.
Keep talking. We're gonna move to Al, but before we do, I just want to remind participants, these are sensitive issues. And all of our panelists are taking tremendous courage to share very personal stories. And so I would ask all participants in the chat room to remain respectful of people's identities and the challenges that we are facing as a society. So over to Al.
Yeah, the journey from homelessness to lived experience leader or lived expert is a long, hard, arduous road with so many potholes to fall into and so many ways to fall backwards. What I learned from my homeless experience was I learned to develop the strength of will and spirit, because you do not survive out there without it. And I learned the wisdom of the homeless life. And I've carried that forward. At first, when you start out on your journey to recovery, you're faced with the stigma of being a person who experienced homelessness, and all that brings, and it's really traumatizing at times, the way that people have been treated. And you go from the stigma of being a person who experienced homelessness and being a second-class citizen to being a person who's tokenized. We get put on tables and committees where we're maybe not ready to be put on, and we're tokenized. We're there because this grant says you have to have a personal lived experience on it. So we sit there, and from personal experience, I've sat at many tables and not being able to say a word, because the greatest casualty of homelessness, besides loss of life, is the casualty of the loss of dignity, self-respect, and self-worth. And that takes years to build up. And in the meantime, you have to put up with a lot of negative energy towards you, a lot of disrespect, and it takes years to build that back up. And when you finally get through the tokenism, and you finally learn how to speak up, you have to somehow do things that give you the respect that you deserve as a human being and as a person with the lived expertise of homelessness, which is sometimes really, really hard to give to others. And so it's a long time respect, a long time journey, a long time. It takes a very long time to get that respect as a person and as a peer, because you're still seen as that second class citizen. But you have to keep trying, and that perseverance that I learned on the street really, really helped me through to become a person who finally had a voice. And I had a voice that wasn't necessarily respected at first, but after a while you learn. You finally get that respect, and you learn how to speak truth to power. And once you get to the point where you can speak truth to power and have the courage to do that, then things can change. But to get there, it can take years. And I had to go through a lot of abuse, believe me, to get to that stage. And the biggest thing that I carried with me from my homeless life is both a privilege and a burden. And that is carrying empathy with me in my heart. And sometimes it's soul-searing and heartbreaking to have that, because you see the crisis that people are in, and you really, really understand the problems that they're going through. You understand the crisis of the moment. And we as lived experts know that to a far greater extent than people who do not have lived experience of homelessness. And so we have to, as so-called experts, we need to really speak up. We need to tell the truth. We need to really stand up, even though, as myself and Emily were talking the other day, we need to sometimes get to stages of or places of discomfort when we're talking to other folks, just to make a point. Because at times it's not good enough just to say things. You have to actually make a solid point on things. So I just want to say that, you know, for all those, I know we have a lot of people with lived experience listening in and watching, and I really just want to say, you know, don't give up the fight. Keep at it. And I know that some of you are still going through battles, and some of you have come through. And you know, just please keep up the fight, because it's worth it in the end. And you know, we do get to places like this where we can become an influence. We are influencers, and that time will come for you as well. And you know, today we are speaking with Adam Vaughn in the audience, you know, and we have spoken to with the Prime Minister on videos and things, and we've talked to the highest offices in the land. It can happen to anyone, but you need to take that courage with you, and don't give up.
Thank you, Al. So we have a number of questions in the pipeline. A number of them, and I had one more question I wanted to put to each of you, but we can sort of move around, and I want to go to where people are interested in the conversation. A number of people have raised the issue of affordable housing. What do we mean by that, and what are we working toward, and what is affordability? So I think this is a big part of it. Like, how do we move this forward, and how do we bring lived experience into that conversation? So I don't know if any one of you, so I'm not going to be a bit more free flowing. If any of you want to pick up if you've been involved in those conversations. Al, if you want to start, sure.
Sure. I don't like the term affordable housing. I do not like it at all, because it means too many different things to too many different people. A person making $10,000 a month, it's different than a person making $800 a month. So we have to start talking, and we have to get the term housing geared to income in the conversation, not affordable housing. If a person's making $800 a month, that person should only be paying 30% of his $800 a month. Affordable means different things. You know, the welfare system may think affordable is something different than that person can afford. So we really need to concentrate on that. And I think the federal government needs to set guidelines, you know, to provinces, or perhaps make part of mandates that a certain percentage of the, you know, rapid housing initiative and programs like that need to be mandated, that a percentage need to be housing geared to income. You know, we had a situation here in Winnipeg where the city of Winnipeg was patting themselves on the back for they bought a property and they're going to build housing on it. But the problem was 80% of market value, which eliminates so many people that, you know, on welfare and living in beneath the poverty line from ever accessing it. So, you know, we need to mandate and have a stronger conviction on what's on building housing that is geared to income and not affordable housing. And, you know, when you're going to give tax breaks to large private corporations to build housing, you have to also make sure that they are adhering to the guidelines on affordable or housing geared to income.
I want to go back to something that Adam Vaughn mentioned at the very beginning of this, and that is that the government is going to remedy the membership of the council, acknowledging that they didn't come out with a full kind of representation of people with lived experience on the council, and that's going to be remedied at the next cabinet meeting. And it prompts the question that that was in the queue of the Q&A, which is, what are some of your expectations of what lived experience will do to the shape of the right to housing framework that is coming to Canada? So I think all of you have opinions on this, so I'm going to go around and I'm going to start with Cheyanne.
Yeah, I think, first of all, Al, thank you so much for answering that question. I would have said exactly the same thing. And
Thank you.
actually, the way that I was going to add on to Al would have segued into what Elizabeth just asked as well. You know, at the end of the day, it's not about affordable housing. It's about housing being a human right. What does that mean when we come from a framework of human rights? And what does adequate housing mean? Not just affordable, what is adequate housing? And what does housing look like for different parts of the populations who have different needs? When it comes to lived expertise and lived expert engagement, I mean, I'm very glad to hear that there's going to be rectification being done in terms of the National Housing Council, in terms of the lack of representation, you know, in regards to people like ourselves. However, you know, I think they could have done what they needed to do from the get-go, but I'm glad they're remedying it, which is great. Thanks, Adam, and so on and so forth. But in terms of lived expert, you know, engagement, it's about making sure that people, not only people like myself and Alex and you know, the people on the screen, but other people are able to be engaged in every single level of change, decision making, evaluation, every single level, from conceptualization to the piloting, to the evaluation, to the reworking of the previous plan to make the plan better, every single level, including the research, the analysis, the synthesis. Every single level needs to have lived experts, not only tokenistically added because we need a lived expert there, but actually, you know, celebrated and recognized as expertise. We often look at academia and professional knowledge as traditional mainstream knowledge, but lived expertise is invaluable. It's priceless. It's the type of knowledge that is always missing and always tokenized in these spaces where transformative changes should be happening, but don't happen because we are not there. And so it's very important to diversify and not just go for people who may, you know, maybe have PhDs or something, I don't know, but it's important to make sure that you have diversified representation and that you're not just saying, okay, you know what, we have 5 people here who are from the lived expertise, you know, population, we're good to go. You have to remember that the lived expertise umbrella is diverse in itself. We have subpopulations, we have subcategories, we have sub-experiences, diverse experiences. So how do we make sure that whoever is coming on board to represent, or I shouldn't even say represent, but to be engaged, do they have networks behind them that they can engage with to bring back information to support what you're doing as well? So those are things that I want to kind of put out there, and to make sure that tokenism doesn't happen, that we look at things from a human rights perspective, that we look at it from an ethical framework. What does ethics mean? And also make sure that young people across lifespans to elders, just because you're 14, 15, 16 doesn't mean anything. I started experiencing homelessness when I was 7 or 8 years old, when I had my first experience of violence. And so how do we make sure that people across lifespans are involved and engaged and meaningfully celebrated and recognized?
Alex, I think you got to talk.
Okay, awesome. Oh, Cheyenne, I'm so excited by what you said. That was awesome, awesome, awesome. And Al, like, yes, rent geared to income is really how we should be approaching these conversations. I read this really incredible article in The Guardian by Leilani Farha from like 2018. And in it, she says, in these conversations about housing rights, we need to be talking about structural change. It's not just about housing, it's about reshaping the systems that cause oppression, that lead to people being oppressed and becoming homeless. So it's about like reconsidering white supremacist colonialism. It's about like dismantling all of these things that put people in situations where they can become homeless. And I think that, you know, speaking truth to power, Al, as you said, is really, really important. And one of the things that we can do as lived experts, at the first Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness conference that I attended way back in 2017, I was in a room full of people, most of whom had lived experience, who were talking about like, how can we do this? How can we make this happen? Have like lived experts embedded in every stage of these conversations. And someone was like, all of these people are coming to the table who don't have lived experience, but their backs are turned. So even if we're here, even if we are part of these conversations, how do we make sure that people listen? Because it's not about like us not having a voice, it's about the reception. There's no uptake of the things that we've been saying for so long. So I think it's like what we're doing, but also what is the structure that we are saying these things in? What is the structure that surrounds the advocacy that we're doing? And until we address those things, we're not going to be able to make the change that we want to see. I remember when I was doing my master's research, I was talking to people broadly engaged in the process of creating housing policy, which meant a lot of different things. But one of the people I interviewed was like a high-level official who was working in sort of like the health and human services sector. And I asked a question that I'd asked a lot of different people. What do you think the role is of lived expertise, and why do you think people with lived expertise are not being engaged more frequently? I had not disclosed my own experiences to her, although I had with a few of the other people that I'd been working with. And she said to me, it's because people are scared of people experiencing homelessness. And it was humiliating. I froze up and I didn't do justice in that moment. I didn't respond appropriately. I didn't push back because I was scared. And a lot of the work that I do now is like hinges on that moment where I feel like I should have said something. And so I think structural change needs to really like reflect all of the things that we've been saying today. There are so many things that go into making this, engagement with lived expertise work.
So well put. Thank you, Alex. And there's a question from, and I'm going to turn to Debbie next, but I just want to read from a question in the queue. Thanks so much to everyone. And by the way, there's a lot of love coming out in these questions. So to all of you, there's just, this is so affirming to see the comments, both in the chat and in the questions. Thanks so much to everyone for sharing. How can we ensure that people with lived experience are supported, trained, given access to take up leadership positions in ways that are not tokenistic, that are outside of the official lived experience positions? And how can allies without lived experience step back and share power? And I know that both of you have just been talking about this, so that doesn't escape me. But imagine now that you're talking to city officials across the country. You're talking to CMHC, you're talking to human rights commissions, you're talking to funders, you're talking to provincial governments. What can they do differently so that there is an ability to authentically engage lived experience in those processes? You've both passionately made the case. Debbie, you've been down this road for 20 years. What are some of the things that make a difference here?
I just had to unmute, sorry. For me, myself, it was inclusion, advocating for inclusion. I started doing advocacy way back. I've done advocacy trainings across Canada. And one of the key components of the advocacy is not just learning how to have your own voice and how to have a voice for others, but how to be inclusive, how to make sure, and Alex and Cheyenne and Al, we've all touched on it, how to make sure that lived experience are at the tables. And that's the goal of, we want to be able, the Lived Experience Leadership Network, our goal is to be able to teach organizations, teach nonprofits, teach funders how to be more inclusive, how to invite the lived experience to those tables. And it's got to start with them, because we're constantly fighting to be at the tables. So unless the organizations, the government, funders start opening up more, then we're going to continue fighting until they do start to listen, and eventually they will. And so I think it's just constantly teaching and teaching. And as far as I'm concerned, for these tables, and I think, Alex, you touched on them a bit, and the tokenism, we can't just have one lived experience at these tables. As far as I'm concerned, at any board level, government level, it should be 50-50. It should be 50% lived experience leadership. And I know that may never happen, but that's my feeling on what it should be. And it's just a matter of continuing to teach people, continuing to teach organizations, continuing to teach government and work with everybody on how important inclusion is, and having us at those tables and hearing our voice, listening to us and realizing, and it goes back to the stigma, because people have the perception that because you're homeless or you came from 20 years of domestic abuse or was a mom at 15 years old, whatever the case may be, that because you have that lived experience, you're stupid, you're dumb, you don't know what you're talking about. You know, they don't take any of the other things, they, you know, like all the stuff I've done for years up to date, where it's got me to where I am. You know, I'm not an academic, I don't talk academically. And so I kind of feel, you know, but I talk from the heart. And I'm very passionate about what I talk about. So the importance to me is to continue teaching and continue getting organizations to reach out to us and to continue learning and keep growing from there. And I hope, you know, someday we will start to see some change. It may have to start small with organizations. You know, Adam, I don't know if he's still here or not. You know, you could set an example by adding us to the table. And on that note, I'll pass it on.
All right, Cheyenne, I think wanted to jump in here.
Yeah, I think that when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, it's not just about inclusion. You have to have an equity lens in terms of the work that you do. And so I was actually the project coordinator for Away Home Toronto, which is a local chapter kind of related to Away Home Canada. And we were interested, what we had to do was create the youth homelessness strategy for the City of Toronto in partnership with the City of Toronto and with a cross-sectoral advisory group membership. And so we had over a dozen, you know, sectors with us, and we worked together with young people. And what ended up happening was I developed the governance model for Away Home Toronto, and it actually worked to equalize or tried to strive to equalize that equity in terms of how young people, because this was about young people's homelessness, how young people are engaged in decision-making processes, but also how is that in juxtaposition with the professionals that are in this membership as well. So we actually created a two-pronged parallel process. So we had a young person's lived expert committee, and then we had the you know, the adult committee members as well, who are professionals from different sectors. But then in terms of decision-making processes, they all made their own decisions, but they came together to actually I guess, you know, talk about the decisions that they're making, that they want to put forward, and creating decisions together. If one doesn't agree with something, it doesn't go through. And so that is a way to kind of re-engage and repurpose the type of decision-making processes that you could do. And the governance model was so successful that people in BC were emailing us, or emailing me, I should say. People in New Zealand were emailing us as well. And so now they've been kind of replicating that. And even today I have a consulting session after this panel actually about some of the engagement model work that I've done. So it's not just about inclusion, it's about asking about what equity means in terms of inclusion. It's talking about how diversity is actualized when you're actually recruiting members. It's not just about including lived experts, it's about doing your due diligence and making sure that you're actually analyzing and doing an environmental scan of what exactly is missing, who is missing, and trying your hardest to figure out how to incorporate all these different identities. And I know that's tough, but where there's a will, you could strive to reach that goal. But in essence, it's not just inclusion, it's about all those things. And if you don't have inclusion, if you don't have equity, if you don't have diversity, if you don't have compassion in your work, if you don't have integrity in your work, if you don't have empathy in your work, then you're not doing justice work at the end of the day.
So well put. There's a question that raises, it's going back to some of the questions of stigma and legitimacy and credibility and voice. And someone has asked, what do we do as advocates if people don't look at us because we have criminal records or we have lived experience with mental health and trauma? And so when you're angry at the system, you know, first you try to raise awareness, and then all of a sudden something comes up and you're not credible, or because you're still processing or triggered or so forth. And I think that's a really important intersectional piece to this and dynamic of what people bring with them. Does anybody have some insights to share with that person or to respond to that question? Just a challenging question. Al, are you leaning forward?
Yeah. You know, I think when people are in that stage, I think they have to find the right ally to go to. And a lot of people are afraid when they're in that stage. Believe me, I know I was there. It's hard to do things on your own, and trust becomes a very big issue. So I think what you have to do is find an ally or a person or an organization that you can really lean on to really help you move forward in your life, because things do get better and things do change. Not necessarily always the way you want them or in the time frame that you want them. And as we all know, you know, patience is truly a virtue when it comes to recovery. I can honestly say that my recovery took 6 years past my homeless life. And so, you know, to give encouragement to that person to say that, yes, you know, the things will get better, but it's not going to happen, you know, today or tomorrow. A doctor gave me that really sound advice. She said, you are going to get there, but it's not going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen the next day. It's not going to happen next year. It's going to take maybe 3 or 4 years, but you will get there. And so, you know, just realizing that it's not a day-to-day process. I mean, it's not something that's going to happen tomorrow or next week, but find a solid ally in your network and use their, you know, sage advice if they have. And just remember, it's not a short process.
Right.
I just wanted to add
I can't do much after that.
I wanted to add something really quickly to that. I just wanted to say also is that we tend to throw around self-care, self-compassion around a lot. And I just wanted to point out that self-care is a privilege, and not everyone has that privilege to practice self-care the way that it may need to be practiced in your own life. And so it's so important to be okay with the journey that you're on, and be okay that, you know, it doesn't look like other people's journeys. But at the end of the day, I think that, you know, it is true. When you're sick one day, or you're having a low day, a low mental health day, I should say, you might be taken less seriously. But let me say something right now to everyone listening, because we have about 200 people on the line. Just because you're having a low day or someone's having a low day does not make them less capable. So you need to destigmatize your mind frame and decolonize your mind frame in order to comprehend that truth. The truth is that just because someone is having a low day does not mean that it makes them less smart, that it makes them less engaging, that it makes them less valuable. Every single person is worthy, they're valuable, and every single journey is worthy of being validated, acknowledged, and, you know, and just seen. And so we need to stop silencing people just because we think that they're having a bad day and whatnot. People oftentimes have the most to say, most going on in their minds on bad days. So, and they're very productive. So let's destigmatize people, not just people experiencing homelessness, but everybody who may be having a low day, right? Because mental health, it transcends race, ethnicity, everything. It transcends experiences, lived experience. So let's destigmatize and let's really validate people, and let's not think of people as less than just because they're having a tough day.
Alex.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that, you know, when we're talking about like inclusion of people with lived experience in spaces where we traditionally have not been, it's not about us changing to fit that model. It's not about us being like board member ready. It's about that space changing, because the reason the systems of power are the way they are is because they're made for certain kinds of people and made to exclude others. So I think, you know, like as a sort of related, unrelated example, I mean, I have a hard time getting proper mental health care because of my mental health conditions. Doctors will dismiss me because of the things that I try and seek care for. And like, I feel like I'm a reasonable advocate in my professional life, but then when it comes to my personal life, I can't get the care that I need because doctors don't take me seriously. And that's really frustrating. And I completely understand, like, you know, why do you have to change in order to be ready to engage in these conversations? And I think that the answer is like, you don't necessarily. And I really love what you said, Al and Cheyenne. I think that one of the things that's really helpful or has been helpful for me is intentionally reaching out to other people with lived experience for support, whether it's an ally or whether it's somebody who is doing this work as well, because multiple voices speaking together are often more powerful in combination, in concert than alone. And so that's been really helpful for me, because yeah, I think that if organizations or you know, yeah, organizations will say are really interested in working with people with lived experience of homelessness, that has to mean changing the status quo. That has to mean changing the way things are done, because you can't just have like the ideal person that you're seeking that will just fit 100% into the structure that you already have. The problem is the structure. So I think that always has to be top of mind. Also, a question from before, how to include people with lived experience. Compensate your lived experts. Compensate them well. And I think that is the very first step. And it means that you have to have a lot of funding, but that's important. That's like number one, super important. So yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Alex, just add on to what your compensation piece, just one phrase, fair equity, okay? Fair wage equity, not just an honorarium, fair wage equity, because you don't pay people less than just because they're a lived expert. They come with experience, they come with their, you know, knowledge, so you pay them accordingly, not just a token $20 an hour or whatever it is that people pay nowadays. I don't even know what that is anymore, because even for the people that I work with who are lived experts, we pay them very well. And so pay them for the expertise that they bring, because that is invaluable, and it should be fair wage equity. Human rights, guys, human rights.
Well, we live in a society where we express value by paying. So if we value it, we need to pay for it. I just want to pick up on something Alex was saying in terms of changing the space. It's about changing the space. And in our pre-conversation to this panel, we were talking about some of the uncomfortable spaces that have had to sort of navigated through in order to make change happen. It needs to get uncomfortable sometimes. It needs to be disruptive, and that's where we see moments of real change. And I think the Vancouver conference was a great example of that. And I think that there's a number of other key moments, but they weren't comfortable moments. People weren't sitting back feeling good about everything as the way it was. It was really about disrupting and seeing change come out of that. We have about 4 or 5 minutes before we're going to round off. So I want to give each of our panelists a chance to say their final thing, and then we'll turn it back to Michelle. Before we go around to the panelists, I want to thank everyone on the call. The questions in the Q&A have been spectacular, and I apologize we could not possibly have gotten through the 47 open questions that are still there. What is great, though, is that we're capturing all of this, and the chat has been terrific as well. So for all of those really supportive comments, thank you. And I think that they mean a lot, and this will be the beginning of a conversation, so we'll have more. But I'm going to turn it back to the panelists for the final word, and I'll start where we began, which is with Al, and then we'll go through to Debbie, to Alex, then to Cheyenne, and then back to Michelle. Al, over to you. You got a minute.
Sure. Okay. I just thank you. I just want to say that I am glad that I went through my homeless experience. It totally changed the value of every value that I had in my life. I don't wish it on anybody, but I'm happy that I went through it because it taught me so much. And it taught me that I can be an effective voice and an effective advocate for those that are going through what I went through then, and those that are still suffering with lived experience but not able to to communicate what they need to say. Being the person with lived experience, I equate it to, and I've used this before, if you're ever watching a baseball game, a football game, a basketball game, any sporting event, the color commentator will always be a person who is a former player or a coach. They bring that intimate lived experience, and they can give out intimate details of what's going on in the game. That is what a person with lived experience is. We are there to stand beside you, to give you the knowledge that you need to make the right decisions and to make the right call. And so I think if this is why we need to be on the panel, on the National Housing Council, to be that voice that's sitting beside you and saying, this is why we do this. This is why this housing program might be better than this one, because we know that innovative housing is really, really important. But you know, please Mr. Vaughn and to others listening, please consider us to be peers, not something lesser than, but the ones that sit beside you and maybe offer you some guiding conversation from time to time. Thank you. Sorry if I went over the minute.
No, that was amazing. Debbie.
I just want to touch on the fact of what Al said too, is my experience and my lived experience has led me to who I am today. And in reality, yeah, I went to university. I got my bachelor degree in Indian social work, 4 years. I've got certificate and bachelor. But in reality, I learned more from my lived experience than I did in 4 years of university. And that's a lesson that I carry with me all the time. And so I think it's important that we grow from these lessons, we grow from our lived experience, and we take that growth with us. And we reach out to others with lived experience and let them know that, you know, we want to be involved with you, we want to work with you, we want to be a part of you, we want you to join us in having a voice. And I just want to touch on, I was just sort of glancing down and I saw a comment about somebody who with lived experience who has spoken at a lot of events and done a lot of speaks, but has never been compensated for it or has never, other than maybe a lunch. One of my mentors once told me, never let anybody underestimate the value of your knowledge. So really push when you're asked to speak, push to be compensated, push to be paid, push whether it's an honorarium, whatever it is, push and tell them. Don't be afraid to say to somebody, my experience is valuable and you need to recognize that. So hear me and compensate me appropriately. And so I'll leave it on that and pass it over to Alex.
Wow, thank you both. I guess just to, it's really hard to find words to conclude this amazing conversation, which I've learned a lot through, and I think from the comments that everyone else has as well. I guess what I want to say is we as lived experts are willing to do this work, to have these webinars, to be on panels, to engage on boards and in organizations, and be in spaces that are sometimes hostile or unwelcoming to us, because of how much it matters. So we wouldn't be here if we didn't know how much this matters. And I just want for people who may not have lived experience, who are listening to the webinar, like just know this is not easy work, but it matters so much. We are able to be people with intimate expertise of this issue. It's something that you can't address homelessness without consulting people with lived experience of homelessness. And more than consultation, deep collaboration, where you're willing to make mistakes and be wrong and sometimes shake things up and shake up the status quo and be willing to listen and make change based on the things that you hear from lived experts. I think I'll leave it with that, because it's just, I think this conversation is so important, and I hope that everybody continues having these conversations after they leave here today.
Cheyenne, you got the last word.
I don't know if that's a good thing. First of all, Nundri is thank you in Tamil, and thank you so much for everybody for even like coming and being here up until the end, listening to us if you're able to, and thank you so much to my fellow panelists. I know I've worked with half of you, and I just met Alex for the first time today, and I hope to continue our relationship past this panel. And thank you to Elizabeth and Michelle and the other Michelle. But for me, it's so important that at the end of the day, ask people how they want to label themselves, okay? We use lived experience. I stopped using lived experience when I was like 20. I actually have advocated for the use of first voice advocates because we're advocates. And that's the language that I use. And I know, Debbie, I think we were in the 2016 panel together, and I said, forget about lived experience, let's use lived experts. And everyone's like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Let's use lived experts. Well, now I'm saying in 2021, let's start using first voice advocates in this sector, okay? Because that elevates people's accountability to treat us like advocates. Treat people even without academic background as advocates, okay? That makes sure that you are leveling that process of engagement. That makes sure that you are respecting that person, reminding yourself to respect that person. Disrespect, not having compassion, those kind of things it should not exist in these spaces. You are in this space for social justice, and part of social justice is respecting and elevating and celebrating people. So make sure we're celebrating each other, make sure that we are celebrating ourselves. And I really hope that this this webinar or this this workshop has been supportive and helpful. I know as panelists, I could speak for myself, and maybe other people will not if they agree with it. I myself have been inspired by my fellow panelists, and I'm constantly learning. And that's the thing, we are learners for life, and that is the first principle that we need to have for ourselves in order to really meaningfully do the work that we're doing.
Thank you. And over to Michelle. Thank you all, and thank you to the National Right to Housing Network and the CLELN for making this conversation happen. I've learned more in the last hour and a half than I don't even want to say, but just fantastic learning and so inspirational. Thank you.
I'm going to repeat the incredible amount of love that's happening, I think, in the chat and the Q&A box. I don't know if folks are similarly having trouble keeping track of the incredible expressions from folks. Our panelists were incredible. My jaw is on the ground. This conversation has so far, I think, surpassed my expectations, I must admit, and my expectations were incredibly high. I want to thank our panelists in particular for the reflections on intersectionality, on gender and race, on the ways that these systemic drivers really drive this experience, and the incredible discussion and solutions that have been developed. Such a timely moment as the right to housing infrastructure is built for this country that I think will really, really determine our future. A couple of just administrative points from folks just to close us up. If you have any questions, reflections, thoughts about the webinar, please feel free to connect with the Canadian Lived Experience Leadership Network. You can find over there a hyperlink or an email address, info@cleln.ca. Please feel free to connect with any of our colleagues over at CLELN, or if you're interested in connecting with the National Right to Housing Network, my email is there, Michelle with 1L @housingrights.ca. I'm also going to ask folks if you'd like to hang out online for a minute or two and just fill out. We have a little poll that we do at the end of these sessions just to be able to gauge how we can adjust our sessions in the future. So please feel free to fill that out. We will have a recording of this session that you will have access to, and I here will commit to sending this to every government contact that I have, as well as very, very widely through our networks, and we will ask you to do the same. I will close by saying this is the start of a conversation. This is the start of an incredibly fulfilling and deeply enriching and critical part of our work. And I can't wait to continue this work together with all of you. So thank you so much for the session, and I look forward to connecting with you in the future.